you. Please do wait for the microphone so everyone can hear. Also, in the interest of getting as many people being able to ask questions as possible, please only ask one question. So no 2 3-parters. And then if there's loads of time, we can always come back to you. You can put your hand up again. So I'm going to just kick things off. I just wanted to ask, first of all, about, so this is based on at least 100 true stories, but when was the first moment that you got the first inkling of that's the story, where does the research rabbit hole take you?
Now, you said you got a 3-parters, but that's...
I know.
I'd say...
The rules don't apply to me.
No, of course. And by the way, if any of my answers go on too long, I think we should just have a system where somebody throws something at me or just says, shut up, because it's quite likely that that will happen. But in terms of... there was one story that struck me, although I didn't know it at the time. Is that possible? I was watching television, and there was a news story about the FBI having arrested what they said was an army planning a full-scale ground war against the United States. And it was such a big story that the Attorney General himself made the announcement. This was about 2006, 2007. And this was going to be the biggest attack on America since 9/11. And I was quite sort of struck by this. And I remembered it in that kind of way that you don't realize you've remembered it. And then 3 years later, I met someone in the States who was involved in the trial and said, you know, that thing was a full-scale ground war against the United States. You know what it really was? I said, I had no idea. He said, it was basically a plan. It was 7 builders who were going to ride into Chicago on horses and take it over. That was billed as the biggest attack on America since 9/11. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, no, what happened was that this bankrupt building company was targeted by an FBI informant, and he offered them $50,000 to come up with a plan to attack the government. Their first plan was to lead a protest to the governor's house about conditions in the projects. The informant said, that's not going to fly, you're not going to get the money for that. And so they just riffed until they came up with something that was satisfactory in the informant's eyes. They decided that they could knock over the Sears Tower and cause a tidal wave which would swamp Chicago. And then when the water subsided, they would ride in on horses because they said people respect a man on a horse. And this was this was real, and they all went to jail. They were all jailed as Al-Qaeda terrorists, even though 6 of them were Haitian Catholics. And it was a kind of, the massive amount of distortion involved in that, I thought must have been a one-off. And then, to your point, I basically looked into it by talking to defense lawyers in the state and discovered that there's about one of these every 3 weeks. So when it says 100 true stories, there's been about 350 with the same kind of architecture, whereby the FBI identifies somebody who they think might be a problem. They ask themselves, all right, what if we leave that person alone and they turn out to be a problem? And they say, we better target them. And what they do is they invent a terrorist plot. They cast those people to try and carry it out. And then when they do, they arrest them for it. And they can persuade them either with false friends, they can send in informants who basically ideologically encourage these people to kind of commit a step program of self-incrimination, or they can offer them money. There was some cases where, like the one I just mentioned with the horses, there was a case in upstate New York where this guy had to be offered $250,000 before he agreed to do anything. $250,000, and in the court case there, the defense said, hang on, but you did offer this guy $250,000. And the informant said, it was code. Exactly. And the defense lawyer said, code for what? And he said, $5,000. And the defense lawyer said, did anyone else apart from you know this code? And he went, no. But the guy still went to jail for 25 years. So, it was just what I thought was a weird curio turned out to be a repeat phenomenon.
And when you were filming this, I read that it was filmed in the Dominican Republic and that it was very much kind of a bit secretive, that it was being, everything was sort of like kept quite secret. Were you at any point concerned that the FBI were going to get hold of the material that you were putting together and that they might somehow intervene in the process of you being able to make the film?
Well, here's the thing. If you want to disrupt a film, it's very easy. All you need is an air horn and you get yourself somewhere near where the film is going on, you can make things go really horribly wrong. Particularly if it's an independent film with not much money, because if you lose a day's filming to some joker with an air horn, then you may well be stuffed. So I'm not saying that this is the primary method that the FBI might use, although the stuff with Nerf guns was told to me by an FBI agent who said, he said, the thing you've got to understand is that 50% of my time is devoted to working out Nerf gun pellet trajectories. And I said, why? And he said, well, because the terrorism task force I work in has a low ceiling. And if I want to disrupt somebody else when they're on their most important call of the day, I've got to get my trajectory just right, otherwise it's going to hit the ceiling, knock him on the head. So the FBI do have various methods up their sleeve which might approach an air horn. But I was a bit concerned that if they find, I sort of thought when we were going to film in America that you might just find that this is really dull admin, but you might find that your location license had just suddenly evaporated on the day you turned up to film, things like that. Just because when I've been around FBI stations to meet FBI agents, they're quite happy to talk about their work on their terms. They give you the grown-up version. They don't tell you the Nerf gun stuff or any of that. But they, there's a sort of supposition that there's an unspoken contract of good behaviour somehow, because they're well cocky. I mean, they think they think they're it. They think everyone else is beneath them. And if anybody decides to criticise them, then I think I thought they might be a pain in the arse. But once you're in the Dominican Republic, there are other things to worry about.
I would like to open up to questions from the audience, so please do pop your hand up. We've got first question just over here.
Hello, I met you earlier. Thank you so much for helping me see this. I've messed up and bought tickets the wrong day.
It was
Bristol,
you.
Right. And you just spoke then quite a lot about interviewing FBI agents. I was wondering if you managed to interview any of the people that were arguably wrongly convicted. And if so, how did you go about doing that? And what, I don't know how to put this without sounding a bit naff, but
Go for it.
what emotive response did you feel like you got if you did manage to talk to any of them? And because I found, especially at the end of the film, very, obviously it's funny, but it's very moving, I think.
I mean, good. I mean, it's meant to be, and I think that comes entirely from the fact that I had to meet people who'd been targeted and their families, because when I first encountered it, it was presented as a sort of procedural anomaly or a procedural distortion, which would have no true meaning unless it was affecting human beings at the other end of that game. So I met quite a few, and I've sort of met people who've, shall we say, decided that violence is a key part of their dialogue with the world, and that did not apply to anyone I met. They were targeted by a hyper-suspicious organisation, which had no idea, because it's difficult, who the real terrorists might be. So they developed a system of sort of turning people into convicted terrorists in the name of protecting the country. To give an example of that, in Boston, the FBI spent at least a year winding up a schizophrenic guy to come up with a crazy plan to fly model planes into the dome of the Capitol building. And they gave him sort of fake Semtex, and he went off to various shops and bought model aeroplanes and assembled what he thought was a viable bomb with their help. And he went to DC, and they arrested him when he got out. And meanwhile, they ignored the two guys who were actually planning to blow up the marathon. So, that was the kind of, if you like, the crux of why it's not a very good idea, even in terms of law enforcement. And in terms of the people on the receiving end, their families are just torpedoed in a sort of terrible Truman Show moment. I mean, the guys in Miami with horses were actually laughing when they were arrested. It would seem so ridiculous to them that they were being arrested for terrorism. none of the people I met, as I say, had anything to do with violence. In fact, one family, there was a guy in Portland who went to the FBI and said, I'm worried that my son, my 18-year-old son, is falling in with the wrong people at the mosque. He might be becoming radicalized. And the FBI said, good work, well done, thank you very much, we've got his back. And then they spent 18 months winding him up until he was so angry he wanted to blow up a truck bomb. Rather than, you know what I mean? So you kind of, and then his family, having thought they did the right thing, alerting the authorities, find that their son is suddenly all over the news because he tried to detonate a truck bomb with, a fake bomb. So I had to meet the families in order to tell the story from Moses' point of view. I mean, that in a way, otherwise it wouldn't have, it would have just been an interesting anecdote.
We'll come to the question in the front here.
Hey, I can probably go with it.
Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Do you see any parallels between, I guess, with the FBI are doing in this film, and it seems like a scaled down version of what the CIA do internationally, and whether it's almost like an American sort of tactic, where it's like after the Second World War, they said, well, we don't want any big wars, so we'll just make sure there's lots of little ones, and sort of almost foment conflict in places where they think it's going to come. And with this film, it seems like they're fomenting conflict because they don't want people to congregate and become actually a threat.
Yeah, so you want a sort of beyond Thomas Pynchon take on the American psyche.
Yeah, please.
Okay. How long have we got? It's
Good time.
I think it is about power, and I think each situation is very particular. So, post 9/11, you have an immediate change of rules permitted by the government. The CIA go running off and start torturing people. Great, we can go back to the 70s. And the FBI have to behave within certain parameters set by the law. And the FBI are also trying to cover their arse because there were certain things they missed in the build up to 9/11. So it's in their interest to say, this stuff is incredibly difficult, and even if we had investigated that computer, we still wouldn't have been able to sort out the attack on the Twin Towers because these people are really clever and they bury themselves deep. And they started fostering the idea that there was a sort of potentially a sleeper cell in every city. George Bush says you're either with us or against us. And so you have a number of factors which permit a sort of reactivation of what the FBI used to do against the civil rights movement with COINTELPRO, whereby they infiltrated people who weren't like them. And the civil rights tended to be black people and they all thought they were communists. And that was blown apart, the rules were changed in the 70s, and 9/11 allowed those rules, allowed the changed rules to be unchanged, and once again the gloves were off. And then it set off in this new direction with a new target of suspicion. So there are things that it has in common with American government policy overall, but I think what it's about is if you start off, if you set off on the wrong course, by the time you get to the end, you're going to be a very long way away from where you should be. And if you basically go, right, the people under suspicion are black and brown, we're going to put their communities under surveillance, and then we're going to work we're going to readapt our drug interception program to intercept terrorists, only we don't know who the terrorists are, so we're going to use enticements to get them up onto the first step of the ladder. You see what I mean? You kind of build this problem by dialing it out of your arse within the law, basically. So I don't think it relates directly to the CIA, but I think it relates to government power and how it's permitted by the law.
Yeah.
Question just up the back here, and then we'll come down front afterwards.
Hello. I just wanted to ask the budget really quickly, and also whether this is being distributed in the US, and if so, what you think the reaction might be.
Right. Well, I've played it a couple of times in the US. Played it at a festival where in front of 1,200 people, which is obviously quite exciting. But I also that was a mainly white audience, so it was about 5% black people. But I wanted to play it to an all-black audience as well, partly just so that I could see whether they just said to me, yeah, we know things are bad, we don't need some fucking mug from Britain to come and tell us. So I sort of got a sense, and I played it at a couple of other places as well, I got a sense of how it would be received. But basically there is a reluctance in America to self-question. And I think a lot of, I mean, I'm talking very gross generalizations, but I think you can see that the people for whom government is problematic but basically a good thing have a different reaction to people who think that the government is basically against you. And in America, it divides horribly simply in black and white terms, racial terms. It really is. Not that there's no crossover, but and in terms of distribution, yes, it's just distributed in the States. You know, we'll have to see who picks it up. In terms of budget, that's an interesting question to me, because I want to know why you want to know.
I am involved in filmmaking, and it's kind of just curious for me to see, because I know the things you do are very much independent, and you manage to make them look really good.
Well, Marcel, the director of photography, is really should be credited for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a sort of quite an honest answer. I think it cost too much, and it cost too much because we had to film it originally in the States, and then when we found the Dominican Republic we could play that for Miami. I mean, there are some bits from Miami as well, but mainly the Dominican Republic. Suddenly you've just got to fly people around and accommodate them. But I am actually guessing, because I don't know the number, but it was in dollars, it was probably 7 or 8 million. And I think if all things being equal, we'd shot it here, by which I mean we'd managed to have suitable locations and so on here, and hadn't had to fly people around, you could probably make it for about £2 million. So the amount we made it for is at I think, not quite the upper end, but it's towards the upper end of what you can do with independent funding. The advantage of independent funding, somebody throw something at me. The advantage of independent funding is that you have multiple sources of funding, so you don't have one overall funder. So it's easier to, I won't say get your own way, but there's no single controlling stake. So yeah, I mean, I you know, the more money you make a film for, the more questions you have to answer afterwards. It's kind of best to make it for as little as possible, I think.
Down here.
Hey, did you, when you were writing it, did you feel like you already, from the beginning, do you feel like you knew where it was going to end and if Moses was going to be arrested? Because I felt like, because I'd watched Four Lions, I kind of knew that the worst possible thing was going to happen in this one.
Well, that's interesting you say that. So you're saying I have a pessimistic view. It didn't used to be like that. Right about the time I turned 30, it all went a bit. But I did, but really that's predetermined by the shape of the stories in the real world. I mean, you can't make a comedy about suicide bombers in which they all walk away happily, because then it wouldn't be a comedy about suicide bombers. And similarly, I mean, seriously, I mean, talk about funding. At that time, somebody wanted to fund it, and he said, I'll give you the money if they all relent and walk away from it. And I said, well, then the whole point, then everybody would realise that they watched a film about not suicide bombers because they don't do anything. And in this, people do have to get arrested and their lives do have to be disrupted. In fact, a couple of black Americans have said to me, I would change one thing. And I was thinking, well, it's made now, but I'm going to listen to your answer anyway. They said, well, Moses should get shot. I was like, fuck it. I mean, and basically, that would be something that they would recognise in their lives. But pedantically, I mean, it doesn't happen in these cases. It's happened in one case. So people don't normally get shot. So I wanted there to be that kind of dismantling of somebody's sense of reality and their existence that happens at the end, rather than Bullet, which is obviously grim, but a different kind of bad ending. So yeah, I mean, I knew where it was going to end, but I didn't know the horse was going to talk.
Okay, we'll take one from here and then the two behind. So if we come to this one first.
Do you think that your choice to shift from quite abstract and abrasive comedy with stuff like Blue Jam and even the day-to-day to quite accessible feature films is because the current political situation that we're in demands that the stuff that you're trying to talk about in your films is more immediately accessible and to a wider audience? Or do you think it was just a shift in taste?
It's really hard. That's impossible. There's no control in that experiment. It could be purely my subjective interest. I think, I mean, I'm not even sure it is to a wider audience. I don't know. I mean, I think when you're making a film, you're usually doing it because you want to tell a story that has a sort of 1, 2, 3, 3-act structure. And so therefore your job is to make it available. You may do that to greater or lesser degree of success, but that's the plan. I think, if you're talking about sketch shows or things where your linearity is broken, then you're doing a different thing, aren't you? So you're not creating a story which has to be integral to itself all the way through. And I guess it's just what the thing requires. If you have an idea, you kind of realize it's a story or it isn't. It's more that. I mean, and I honestly don't. I mean, you only really know what interests you, and then you think about it afterwards. You follow your interest, and then you think about it afterwards. And even then, I'm not very good at doing that, as I'm demonstrating now. So, that's not even an answer, is it? It's just some words. Will that do?
We can take the next question.
How come you decided to go for American politics instead of British politics? Surely British politics at this point in time is an absolute cluster of stuff and ripe for the picking. So
As if American politics isn't. The reason actually is possibly to do with my time management, but I think thematically it's because, well, as I said, the story sort of struck me and dawned on me over time, and by the time I discovered that these really quite surreal, or at least highly distorted sting operations were in fact part of operational law in the States, I think the question became global. It's about the thing that lost its name. I can't remember when it lost its. When did the War on Terror lose its name? It doesn't have a name anymore, but it carries on nonetheless. It carries on spending a lot of our money. It carries on changing a lot of our laws. I don't know if everybody here is totally happy with having their phones read inside out, as a matter of course under the Investigatory Powers Act, which is this close to being passed. But that's part of the War on Terror as well. So whether or not the story is about America, at this point I could say, well, I made it so that we could all look at America and go, aren't they awful? But it's really that there's a sort of dominant mindset that affects us all. And just because the American legal system permits this, I mean, these things have a 99% conviction rate. And if you talk to someone at the Department of Justice, they say, I know it should be 100. And they're not joking. They're saying that they're the best lawyers in the land and that they try the best possible defense against themselves before they even make the arrest, which is one reason why these cases are so striking. But it doesn't mean that there isn't some similar kind of thinking here. And I think that since 2001, we've been encouraged to think in an us and them kind of way. So in a way, this story, although it's set in America, felt like it spoke about a bigger thing that does affect us, albeit in a different way.
I read a third question just over here. If you could pop your hand up again, yep, we'll get the microphone to you.
Well, unfortunately, you sort of semi-answered it anyway, because my question was going to be, what is it about the subject of terrorism with this and Four Lions that I agree with you, but what is it that you think makes this such a right sort of line for comedy?
I can give a different answer. Actually, no. I mean, it's. I'm trying to think if there is another angle, but I suppose it's a very specific form of unfairness, it seems to me, and I think that the situation that we're in, both here and in the States, is about division. And I think that the war on terror was an extremely strong, divisive beat in our story, you know, in our political evolution, which carries on to this day. Now, it's designed to be that, I think. I mean, those kind of, call them asymmetric attacks, like the Twin Towers attack, are designed to do that. They're designed to cause an overreaction. But I think the significant thing is it is an overreaction, and it doesn't just mean conducting wars and spending money, but it means a mindset where you've added another division to society. So in a way, I think it carries on. It's not the single cause of where we are now, but I think it is one of them. And in fact, this is a book written by a guy who is an ex-FBI agent, who is very reasonable, very cool-headed. He joined the FBI because one of the jobs of the FBI is to uphold civil rights. He used to investigate right-wing extremism. He used to sort of get involved in the groups, and then he didn't have to wind them up. He'd just find out when they did something wrong, and then that was cause for arrest. And on one case, he drew his boss's attention to the fact that the evidence was being rigged. And from that point on, he was frozen out of everything, and he realized he had to leave. He didn't go mad. He just worked then for civil rights. And the reason I'm mentioning this book is that he actually puts forward quite a good argument that the FBI bears a good percentage of responsibility for giving America Trump by carrying out the sort of divisive thinking that was instigated after 9/11. And I think that's why and it's sometimes quite easy to forget that, particularly when the division is so rancorous at the moment and is communicated at the crass level of tweets. It's quite hard to forget the deep drivers of it. So that would be my more pretentious answer to the same kind of inquiry.
Thank you. We're going to have time for one more. There was one up the back on this side. If you could pop your hand up again, person. Yeah, we'll come to you. I think that will have to be the last one.
Chris, this seems tremendously simplistic after the questions we've had, but as a writer and a director, which do you prefer?
That's great, actually, because I think I'm metabolically suited to directing. There's a lot of, it's just it's a very active job. I sort of hate the process of writing in terms of its lack of activity, but you have to do one to do the other, and therefore you're going to end up a mess. I wish the balance was different. Some people I know who sort of write all the time and don't direct they just have a different composition. I think I have some very shit old sort of trial software in the writing part of my brain, which means I have to really kind of write the code to do it, and directing, which is basically just walking around muttering or shouting. Do you want more detail? Is that? I'll do another one. I'll do another one.
Actually, if we can take one more question, because that one was quite short. We'll come to maybe just over here.
Hi, I was just wondering whether you'd ever consider setting your sights on the sporting world, given all the kind of hypocrisies of big corporations and desert stadia with migrant labour. But I suppose to crystallise that, my question would be, how much do you hate Sebastian Coe?
It's a funny one, isn't he? I think he'd done less when I said that than it turned out. You know, it was highly prescient, wasn't it? I mean, look, the sports. I'm really bad on sports, but I did come across something quite interesting. This is really tangential, but bear with me. And it does sort of tie back into the terrorism thing, and division, and maybe lack of trust. Do you remember the London Bridge attacks in 2017? Quite quickly after that, there were signs up saying, "I love London," and those kind of positive responses. I discovered recently, and I mean this isn't a sort of hidden fact, it's just reported, those signs were put up by a government-funded PR company and there's one in every major city whose job it is to respond positively if something bad happens. So as well as the putting up posters, "I love London," which demonstrated immediately that London was, you know, a great place and prepared to respond positively in a crisis, there was a phone call made at that time which went, "We're going to need the 100 imams." And this will get round to sport, by the way. And that was because the PR company had said, if there is a terrorist attack, we want to get 100 imams to come and go to wherever the attack was and say, "We condemn this, you know, we all love Britain, this is all great." But it was a PR company that was doing this. And I thought that was fucking terrible because it doesn't trust the population to do it themselves. And when the 7/7 attacks happened, London responded, I think, pretty well without any government help. You know, there were 3-minute silences, people did, you know, "I'm not afraid," and then some people did, "I'm very afraid," and there was a kind of a whole range of responses that were basically good and not government sponsored. And once the government is paying for cosmetically good responses to bad things, then, I mean, we're fucked anyway, but we're another notch fucked. And it came about because of sport. So that, to put the origin of it was the 2012 Olympics, and the government in the wake of the 2011 riots said, if something bad happens, we don't want to look like a country that cannot behave itself. So they set up these units to, as well as try and make sure nothing bad did happen at the Olympics, which is fine, obviously, they set up positive responses that would happen in case it did. I'm afraid that's the best I can give you on sport. It's not really very relevant, is it?
That's great, thank you so much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Please join me in thanking Chris very much. Thank you.